All right, here we go. Let's keep this review going here. I don't know if you guys be able to watch all of these in class, but you guys can watch them all at home, getting yourself ready here. Hopefully, give you some good tips, some things to remember, so you guys can knock out big quiz number 3 come Monday. So, I want to get to some categories and subcategories here. So that sounds like that's one of the things there's still some questions on, but let me check off a few other things. So you get full credit for everything. You got to show your work, show your calculations. So when you're doing nominal GDP or real GDP, go ahead and show me exactly. Don't just put the number, because if the number's wrong and you just punch it into your calculator, I can't give you any partial credit. So what you got to do is show the work. So if you've got, 10 pounds of poi, 10 times whatever the price of poi is, put that in parentheses, plus, 2 bicycles times $200 plus, whatever it is, show me all of your work so you can get all the credit. Because there will be times where somebody punched a number in. But if I can look back at the work and go, okay, they missed this part, they got the wrong thing, they maybe picked the wrong price out of the table, we can still give you most of the credit. But you got to show all your work and all your calculations. Another thing on that is I was working with a couple of you guys yesterday, and one of the things to remember is to round to 2 decimals on all this. Don't get rounding so fast, because all of a sudden you've got, a GDP deflator of 112.36, and if you start rounding that, and then you do the percentage change between that and another year's GDP deflator, all of a sudden those rounding things are going to make you way off. So make sure, do not round more than 2 decimal points. I think, a lot of you guys use your calculators, which is fine. This is not the kind of this kind of calculation. Usually, AP test will have something real simple on there that you could just do in your head because there's no calculators there. But this one, it's going to have some numbers that you probably want to use a calculator for. I mean, just to kind of check yourself, I know. If you're doing it in your calculator, go ahead and just don't even round at all. Try to get that as precise as possible until you get to the final answer, and round to 2 decimal places. And that's on all the calculations. Any of the rates of inflation, unemployment rate, any of that, let's go to 2 decimal places. Okay? All right, so I think you guys have been pretty good on the calculations. Another thing, unemployment, got to know the calculation. Unemployment, labor force participation rate. Making sure that we understand how we get to what the NIAP is. We subtract out the kids, we subtract out the institutionalized, how we get to the labor force, and then how we get those rates. Okay. Also the status, that we understand what status. Is someone in the labor force? Are they not in the labor force? Are they in NIAP? Are they not in NIAP? If they're unemployed, what kind of unemployment? Is it cyclical, structural, frictional, seasonal? So we need to make sure we know those. One of the things that sometimes students trip up a little bit on is when we have a change and then there's the change in the ratio. Now, sometimes if it's just one of the numbers, the numerator or the denominator changing, that's pretty basic and straightforward. And the one that gets tricky is when they have both change. So I know you guys saw that in the unemployment video, and you might want to check that out and just make sure you're ready for that. Especially that case of the discouraged worker, which I think is really a critical thing right now with the state of the economy. We have a lot of those discouraged workers. So sometimes we might see right now that this improvement in the unemployment rate recently, previously it was around 9.9, now it's at 9.6. We'll see what it is coming out tomorrow. That might not be an indication that things are getting better. It might be an indication that some people have dropped out of labor force. So we want to keep track of the number of discouraged workers. You might even check that out when you look at the report tomorrow on unemployment. Okay, so make sure that we're ready for that on the unemployment. Okay, I'm going to come to those later. Let's get right into those categories because that sounded like a big important thing. When I give you some of these problems and I say, is it included in GDP or not included, you're going to need to tell me, if it's included, what category it's under. Now, that's consumption. The major categories: consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. But I want you to go a step deeper and tell me about the subcategory that it's included in. Okay? If you're able to do this, you're really able to really understand what's going on with GDP. Okay, so the subcategories. But then, if it's something that's not included, I want you to tell me why it's not included. And so you see some of those on the practice big quiz, but let's just go through some of these here that sometimes trip some people up. First of all, in the subcategories for consumption. Under consumption, we have durable goods, non-durable goods, and services. So now, the non-durables is pretty straightforward. Those are things like food and clothes, things that we consume and they're gone. Okay, and I know sometimes people go, well, that's a little tricky with clothes. But clothes, if they're not worn out physically, they may go out of fashion. Okay, I don't worry about that. I just wear what I wear. But in terms of counting it, those are things that wear out quickly and they're gone. The non-durable, or I'm sorry, the durables. That's like a television. That's like a refrigerator, a car. Those kinds of things would be under the non-durable, or I'm sorry, the durable good consumption. A sofa. Okay. Now, those are pretty straightforward. We just have to remember that sometimes, for example, if the Bishop School buys a new van, that's not going to get counted under consumption because that's not a household. Households are the ones who do the consumption. That car, that's an investment. That's a fixed business investment because a business has purchased that car. So sometimes the same good gets counted in different categories. So we want to be careful of that. Also, we want to make sure that it's the final goods and services. So if I buy flour to make cookies at my house for our own consumption, that's a final good. So the value of the flour gets added under what subcategory? That's right, non-durable. Okay, so that flour would get counted that way. However, if a bakery buys that so that they can bake cookies and then sell those, the value of the flour is going to be included in the value of the cookies. And so if we count the flour, it's double counting. So we want to be careful about that. Okay, so again, those subcategories: non-durables, durables, and services. Now the investment. Investment ones get a little bit trickier, but remember the investment. This is what businesses are doing. 3 categories under investment. 1, fixed residential. Now you might not even think of that as business, but remember, I always like to think about it this way. Whenever someone buys a house, they just started a business because they're a landlord. Okay? They could rent that out to someone else and then collect a rent, which would make them an obvious landlord, like Mr. Asaf. Or if they buy it and they live in it, they're effectively their own landlord. Now we know they don't make out a payment. And this is the one that's a little bit tricky because we talk about the market value of all final goods and services. If I make cookies at my house and eat them, we're not going to go figure out how many people made cookies at their house and try to get the value. We just count the value of the final goods and services. So we know that there's some household production that's not included in GDP. But housing is different. Housing is different because of the magnitude of it. We're talking huge. In fact, if everybody who owned a house simply traded titles with their next door neighbor, all of a sudden they're paying rent to their neighbor, but the other neighbor's paying rent to them, so it's kind of a wash. It didn't change the amount of housing services that had been produced. Those people are still living in the houses. But now it's getting counted in GDP. And so that's a really tricky problem here. The more owner-occupied housing that you have, the less rent that's collected, but there's still the same amount of housing. And remember, the intent here with GDP is to calculate the value of all the goods and services produced in the economy. So owner-occupied housing is going to be included. Now, as I said that here, I need to step back because what is housing? Housing is a service. That's counted back under consumption. Consumption of services. Now, that's the rent and also the imputed value where we're going to just estimate. If somebody lives in a home in a neighborhood where the average rent is $2,000, then we're going to count that toward consumption spending, even though they didn't actually write out a check, but it's as if they had written one out to themselves. So they don't have to go through that process. Okay? So that's a tricky one for people. Now, I was talking about investment, fixed residential. Investment is when there's a new house. Now we got to be clear here. Houses are the factories. A house is a factory. It produces housing services. A hospital, it's a factory. It produces medical services. A farm, it's a factory. Produces agricultural products. Okay? A school, that's a factory. It produces educational services. So if you think about it in that concept, a house is a factory. So we're going to count the value of the home, that value of that house,